In the vast expanse of the ancient world, where the boundaries between civilization and wilderness shifted like sand in the wind, a great empire began to stir in the heartlands of what would one day be called Iran. The year was somewhere around 550 before the Common Era, and across the known world, the established powers of Egypt, Babylon, and Lydia held dominion over their respective territories, each believing their reign would last forever. Yet in the highlands of Persia, among the rugged mountains and fertile valleys where nomadic tribes had roamed for countless generations, a transformation was beginning that would reshape the very fabric of the ancient world. The air in those highland regions carried the scent of juniper and wild thyme, and the sound of horses' hooves on stone echoed through narrow passes where eagles soared overhead. Here, among the Achaemenid clan of the Persian tribes, a young prince named Cyrus was coming of age in a world where tribal loyalty meant everything, and the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly toward distant lands filled with unimaginable wealth and mystery. The Persians had long been subjects of their Median cousins to the north, paying tribute and acknowledging the supremacy of kings whose courts glittered with gold and whose armies had conquered much of the region. But beneath this submission lay a restless energy, a sense that the natural order of things might yet be overturned by someone with sufficient vision and courage. Cyrus possessed both qualities in abundance, though in his youth he could hardly have imagined the scale of what lay ahead. The Persian court, while impressive by the standards of its time, was modest compared to the great palaces of Babylon or Memphis, yet it fostered a warrior culture that valued merit alongside birth, practical skill alongside noble lineage. The young prince learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, mastered the bow and spear, while other royal children played with toys of gold and ivory, and absorbed the ancient Zoroastrian teachings that spoke of light conquering darkness, truth prevailing over falsehood. These lessons would prove more valuable than all the treasuries of the East, for they instilled in him a sense of divine purpose that would sustain him through the campaigns to come. When Cyrus finally moved against his Median overlords around 550, the rebellion unfolded with startling swiftness. The Median king Astyages, grown complacent after decades of unchallenged rule, found his own nobles deserting him as news of the Persian uprising spread throughout his realm. Ancient loyalty bonds dissolved like morning mist as tribal chieftains calculated the shifting odds and decided that this young Persian prince might indeed represent the future rather than the past. The decisive battle took place in the shadow of the Zagros Mountains, where the clash of bronze and iron rang out across valleys that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless petty kingdoms. When the dust settled and the carrion birds began their grim work, Cyrus stood victorious, and the Median Empire had become merely the first jewel in what would become the greatest crown of conquest the world had yet seen. From this foundation in the Iranian highlands, the newly proclaimed King of Kings began to cast his gaze toward the horizons that had once seemed so distant. The wealthy kingdom of Lydia beckoned from the west, its capital at Sardis, renowned throughout the ancient world for the unprecedented riches of its ruler, Croesus. The very name had become synonymous with wealth beyond measure, for Lydian craftsmen had perfected the art of working electrum, that mystical alloy of gold and silver that flowed from the river Pactolus. Caravans laden with precious goods travelled the royal roads that connected Sardis to the Greek cities along the Aegean coast, carrying silk from distant China, spices from the lands beyond India, and works of art crafted by master artisans whose skills had been honed across generations. The conquest of Lydia unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of military precision and political cunning. Cyrus understood that victory required more than mere force of arms. It demanded an appreciation for the delicate web of relationships that bound the ancient world together. When his armies finally approached the walls of Sardis in 546, the siege that followed demonstrated his mastery not only of conventional warfare, but of psychological manipulation. The Persian engineers, drawing upon techniques learned from their Mesopotamian neighbors, constructed elaborate siege works, while Cyrus simultaneously negotiated with potential allies within the city walls. the fall of Sardis sent shockwaves throughout the eastern Mediterranean. For, if even Croesus, with all his legendary wealth, could not withstand the Persian advance, what hope did lesser rulers possess? With Lydia subdued, the Greek cities of Ionia found themselves face to face with a new reality. These proud settlements, which had grown prosperous through trade and colonial expansion, suddenly discovered that their familiar world of city-state independence was giving way to something far grander and more terrifying. The Persian administrative system, refined through years of governing diverse populations across vast distances, began to extend its reach westward toward the waters of the Aegean. Local tyrants and oligarchs, who had once concerned themselves primarily with disputes between neighboring cities, now found themselves dealing with satraps who reported directly to the great king in his magnificent capital at Pasargadae. Yet even these western conquests represented only the beginning of Cyrus's grand design. The ancient kingdom of Babylon, heir to millennia of Mesopotamian civilization, still controlled the vital trade routes between east and west, north and south. Its hanging gardens were numbered among the wonders of the world. Its astronomers tracked the movements of celestial bodies with unprecedented precision, and its libraries contained the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of scribes and scholars. The Babylonian king Nabonidus, however, had alienated many of his subjects through religious innovations that challenged ancient traditions, creating opportunities that a skilled conqueror might exploit. The campaign against Babylon showcased Cyrus's evolution from tribal war leader to sophisticated practitioner of imperial statecraft. Rather than simply besieging the city and reducing it through starvation and assault, he portrayed himself as a liberator sent by the Babylonian god Marduk to restore proper religious observances and free the people from an impious ruler. This masterpiece of propaganda, preserved for posterity in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, demonstrated how thoroughly the Persian king had absorbed the lessons of governing diverse populations, with their own deeply rooted cultural traditions and religious beliefs. When Babylon opened its gates in 539, the event marked more than just another military victory. It represented the birth of a new model of empire based on tolerance and accommodation rather than simple domination and exploitation. The Jewish exiles, who had languished in Mesopotamian captivity for decades, suddenly found themselves free to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. While Babylonian priests discovered that their new Persian overlords showed genuine respect for local customs and religious practices. This approach would prove instrumental in creating the stability necessary for an empire that stretched across 3 continents and encompassed dozens of distinct cultural groups. The administrative genius of Cyrus and his successors lay in their recognition that lasting conquest required more than military superiority. It demanded the creation of systems that could accommodate diversity while maintaining central control. The satrap system that emerged during these formative years established provincial governors who possessed considerable autonomy in local matters, while remaining accountable to the central authority for taxes, military levies, and overall loyalty. Royal roads began to stretch across the empire, facilitating communication and trade, while enabling the swift movement of troops when necessary. A standardized coinage system gradually replaced the bewildering variety of local currencies, making commerce more efficient and binding distant regions together through economic interdependence. As word of Persian victories spread throughout the Mediterranean world, rulers from Egypt to Scythia began to reassess their strategic positions. The pharaohs who had dominated the Nile Valley for 3,000 years suddenly found themselves confronting the prospect of incorporating their ancient kingdom into this expanding Persian domain. The Greek city-states, still emerging from their own dark age and beginning to develop the distinctive political and cultural innovations that would define classical civilization, watched with growing unease as Persian influence crept steadily westward across the Aegean islands. The death of Cyrus in 530, during a campaign against nomadic tribes beyond the empire's northeastern frontiers, might have spelled the end of Persian expansion under a less capable dynasty. Instead, his son Cambyses II proved equally committed to the vision of universal empire. turning his attention toward the conquest of Egypt and the completion of his father's grand design. The stage was thus set for the confrontation that would define the next chapter of ancient history, as the expanding Persian Empire began to press against the emerging Greek world with its radically different concepts of governance, individual liberty, and civic participation. The vast Persian dominions stretched like a tapestry across the known world, their borders touching distant shores and mountain ranges that seemed to dissolve into myth. Yet within this sprawling empire, beneath the golden eagles and flowing banners of Achaemenid rule, currents of discontent began to stir in the coastal cities of Asia Minor, where Greek voices whispered of freedoms lost and ancestral ways abandoned. The year was 499 BCE, and along the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, the first flames of what would become an epic confrontation between East and West began to kindle in the marble-columned streets of Miletus. The Ionian cities had known Persian rule for half a century, ever since Cyrus the Great's generals had swept down like autumn winds through the river valleys and coastal plains of western Anatolia. These were not barbarous settlements cowering before foreign masters, but proud Greek polis with their own traditions of governance, their own gods dwelling in temple precincts fragrant with incense and olive oil. Miletus, greatest among them, had once sent colonies across the Black Sea, like seeds carried on favorable winds, establishing daughter cities that bore her name and customs to distant shores. Her merchants had grown wealthy on trade routes that connected the grain fields of Scythia with the workshops of Phoenicia, their ships cutting through Mediterranean swells heavy with amphorae of wine and oil. Under Persian administration, these cities had prospered in material ways, their harbours bustling with commerce that flowed along the great royal roads like blood through arteries of empire. The Persian system, pragmatic and tolerant, allowed local customs to flourish while demanding only tribute and loyalty to the great king who ruled from his palace at Persepolis. Yet prosperity could not quiet the deeper stirrings of the Greek spirit. That restless energy that found expression in the clash of debate in public squares, in the selection of magistrates by lot or vote, in the fundamental belief that free men should govern themselves according to laws they had helped to shape. The spark that would ignite this simmering discontent came in the person of Histiaeus, tyrant of Miletus, a man whose ambitions burned as brightly as the bronze mirrors that reflected sunlight from temple roofs. Summoned to the Persian court at Susa, he had been honoured with gifts and titles, kept close to the throne where Darius could watch his clever mind at work. Yet distance from his beloved Miletus gnawed at him like a slow poison, and in his enforced exile among the silk-draped halls of the palace, he began to weave schemes as intricate as the Persian carpets beneath his feet. Through secret messages tattooed on the scalp of a trusted slave, he reached across the empire's breadth to his nephew Aristagoras, who ruled in his stead, urging him to raise the standard of revolt. Aristagoras needed little encouragement, for his own position had grown precarious after a failed expedition against the island of Naxos had left him indebted to Persian creditors and facing the displeasure of the satrap Artaphernes. The weight of obligation pressed upon his shoulders like a bronze breastplate, and in that pressure he saw both danger and opportunity. If the Ionian cities could throw off their Persian yoke and restore their ancient liberties, if the flames of rebellion could spread across Asia Minor like wildfire through dry grass, then perhaps the great empire that seemed so invincible might reveal itself to have feet of clay. The revolution began not with the clash of bronze on bronze, but with a symbolic gesture that rippled outward like stones cast into still water. In the agora of Miletus, before assembled citizens, whose faces reflected both hope and uncertainty, Aristagoras laid aside the purple-bordered robe that marked his tyranny and declared the restoration of democratic governance. The words fell upon the crowd like warm rain after drought, and soon similar scenes played out in cities throughout Ionia as tyrants were expelled and popular assemblies reconvened in spaces that had long echoed only with the measured tones of appointed officials. Yet rebellion, once begun, required more than noble sentiments and democratic enthusiasm. The Persian military machine that had conquered kingdoms from India to Egypt would not be deterred by civic proclamations, however stirring. Silver and bronze would be needed, ships and trained soldiers, alliances that could transform scattered city-states into a force capable of matching the disciplined ranks that marched beneath the peacock banners of the great king. Aristagoras understood this calculus with the clarity of morning light breaking over mountain peaks, and his thoughts turned westward across the Aegean toward the free cities of mainland Greece, where the very name of Persian rule was still associated with distant lands and foreign customs. The ship that carried him from Miletus cut through waters that reflected the deep blue of an autumn sky, its white wake marking a line between the world of Persian dominion and the realm of Greek independence. At Athens, that city crowned with temples and alive with the voices of citizens debating in the shadow of the Acropolis, he found an audience eager to hear tales of Persian tyranny and Greek suffering. The Athenians, themselves recently delivered from the rule of tyrants and proud of their new democratic institutions, listened as he painted word pictures of their kinsmen across the sea, labouring under foreign masters, their ancient freedoms trampled beneath Persian boots. The appeal struck resonant chords in Athenian hearts, for they remembered their own struggles against autocracy and could imagine all too clearly the fate that might await them should Persian power continue its westward expansion. The assembly voted to send 20 ships, a modest force by the standards of great empires, but a commitment that would prove to have consequences far beyond its apparent weight. These vessels, their hulls dark with pitch and their bronze rams gleaming in harbour sunlight, represented more than military aid. They were a declaration that the Greeks of Europe would not stand idle while their cousins in Asia fought alone against overwhelming odds. From Eretria, on the island of Euboea, came 5 additional ships, their crews adding their voices to the growing chorus of defiance that began to echo across Ionian waters. The combined fleet, 25 vessels in all, seemed pitifully small when measured against the vast resources that Persia could bring to bear. Yet their arrival at Ephesus marked a moment of transformation. For the first time since the great conquests of Cyrus, Greek had raised sword against Persian, not in some distant frontier skirmish, but in organized resistance that carried the implicit challenge of one vision of civilization against another. The confederation of rebel cities stretched along the coast like pearls on a string, each one adding its own character and resources to the common cause. Ephesus, with its great temple of Artemis, whose marble columns rose like a forest of stone, provided wealthy merchants who understood the networks of trade and communication that bound the empire together. Chios contributed sailors whose knowledge of wind and current had been passed down through generations of island dwellers. From the northern cities came men who had traded with the Scythians beyond the Black Sea and knew the fierce independence of peoples who had never bowed to any king. The early successes of the revolt spread like ripples from a stone cast into calm water. The coastal cities fell to the rebels with surprising ease, their Persian garrisons overwhelmed by the sudden uprising of populations they had thought pacified. The great road that carried Persian messengers and administrators inland towards Sardis, capital of the western satrapies, became a pathway for Greek armies marching beneath banners that bore the owl of Athena and the symbols of their various cities. The very foundations of Persian control in Asia Minor seemed to tremble like leaves in an autumn wind. At Sardis itself, that ancient seat of Lydian kings, where Croesus had once displayed his legendary wealth, the rebels achieved their greatest symbolic victory. The lower city fell to their assault, its streets echoing with the sound of Greek voices raised in songs of triumph. Though the citadel held out upon its rocky height like an eagle's nest defying the storm, the burning of the lower town sent pillars of smoke rising into the sky that could be seen for miles. A beacon announcing to all who beheld it that Persian power was not invincible, that the great empire could bleed when struck by determined enemies. Yet in that very moment of triumph lay the seeds of future catastrophe, for among the buildings consumed by flames was a temple sacred to Cybele, the great mother goddess, whose worship the Persians had honoured according to their tolerant customs. This act of apparent sacrilege, whether intended or merely the unfortunate consequence of urban warfare, would be remembered in the court of Darius long after the rebels had retreated to their ships, and the ashes of Sardis had grown cold beneath the weight of Persian retribution. The flames of rebellion in Ionia had been extinguished, but like embers scattered by wind, they had ignited something far more dangerous across the narrow waters of the Aegean. Darius the Great, seated upon his golden throne in the sprawling palace complex of Persepolis, received news that would reshape the ancient world. The Greek city-states of the mainland had dared to send ships and soldiers to aid their Ionian cousins, burning the sacred city of Sardis and defiling Persian soil with their presence. The great king's response would echo through the marble halls of Athens and the olive groves of Attica with the thunderous certainty of approaching storm clouds. In the vast administrative chambers of the Persian capital, scribes worked by lamplight, their reed pens scratching across papyrus as they recorded the mobilization of an empire. Ships were commissioned from Phoenician harbors, where cedar planks gleamed with fresh tar and bronze fittings caught the Mediterranean sun. Cavalry units assembled on the plains of Media, their horses stamping the packed earth as morning mist rose from distant mountains. Infantry regiments marched through dusty roads that connected the far reaches of the known world, their spears creating forests of glinting metal that stretched beyond the horizon. The machinery of imperial conquest, perfected through decades of expansion, began its inexorable turn toward the west. The expedition that emerged from Persian ports in the spring of 490 BCE carried with it the weight of absolute authority. Artaphernes, nephew of the great king, commanded alongside Datis the Mede, a general whose reputation for swift, decisive action had been forged in campaigns from the Caspian steppes to the valleys of Anatolia. Their fleet, numbering perhaps 600 vessels, rode the swells of the Aegean like a floating city, its sails darkening the waters beneath. Transport ships heavy with provisions followed sleek warships whose bronze-sheathed rams cut through the waves with predatory grace. The holds contained not merely soldiers and supplies, but the marble blocks and golden ornaments that would proclaim Persian dominion over new lands, confident symbols of victory carved before the first battle had been fought. Island after island submitted to this overwhelming display of imperial might. The sacred Isle of Delos, birthplace of Apollo, watched Persian ships anchor in its harbour as priests offered prayers to gods who seemed suddenly distant and powerless. Naxos, which had once defied Persian authority, found its walls breached and its temples emptied of treasure. The Cyclades became stepping stones across the wine-dark sea, each conquest bringing the Persian host closer to the mainland, where Athens waited like a jewel upon the Attic peninsula. When the Persian fleet finally appeared off the coast of Euboea, the morning sun illuminated hundreds of sails stretched taut against the northern wind. The city of Eretria, which had sent 20 ships to aid the Ionian revolt, now faced the full wrath of imperial retribution. For 6 days, the Persians laid siege to its walls, while battering rams thundered against ancient stones and arrows darkened the sky like flights of migrating birds. The city's fate was sealed not by Persian might alone, but by the treachery of its own citizens, who opened the gates in exchange for promises of mercy that would prove hollow as morning mist. Smoke rose from Eretria's temples and houses, carrying with it the dreams of a people who had dared to defy an empire. Yet the true prize lay across the narrow strait, where the towers of Athens caught the light of dawn and cast long shadows across the Attic plain. The Persian commanders chose their landing ground with the calculating precision of veteran strategists. The Bay of Marathon, 26 miles northeast of Athens, offered a wide beach suitable for beaching their ships, and a broad plain where Persian cavalry could maneuver freely. The coastal road provided a direct route to the Athenian heartland, while the surrounding hills would prevent enemy reinforcements from arriving undetected. Here, on this crescent of sand backed by marshland and mountains, the fate of Greek independence would be decided. The Persian army that spread across the Marathon plain resembled a vast carpet woven from the threads of empire. Immortals in their scale armor and felt caps stood in perfect ranks, their spears catching the light like a forest of golden reeds. Scythian archers tested their bowstrings, while Median cavalry watered their horses at streams that had never reflected such exotic riders. The air filled with the sounds of a dozen languages as officers shouted orders in Persian, Phoenician, and Egyptian, creating a babel of imperial authority that echoed off the surrounding hills. Supply trains stretched back toward the beached ships, where stevedores unloaded amphoras of wine, sacks of barley, and bundles of arrows cut from the ash forests of Hyrcania. Meanwhile, in Athens, the assembly gathered in heated debate as news of Marathon's occupation reached the city. The great statesman Miltiades, veteran of wars in the Thracian Chersonese, argued for immediate action, while others counseled caution or even submission. The decision, when it finally came, reflected the fierce independence that had driven Athens to aid the Ionian rebels, despite overwhelming odds. The city's 10,000 hoplites would march north to Marathon, joined by perhaps 1,000 Plataeans, whose small city had chosen alliance with Athens over submission to Persia. Against the vast host of the great king, this modest force seemed as insignificant as pebbles cast against a mountain. The Greek army that assembled in the foothills overlooking the Marathon plain presented a stark contrast to their Persian opponents. Bronze-armed hoplites adjusted the leather straps of their shields while checking the long ash spears that would form their battle line. Their equipment, though uniform in function, bore the individual character of citizen soldiers who had purchased their own armor from local smiths. Dented helmets spoke of previous campaigns, while polished bronze reflected the faces of farmers and merchants who had left their shops and fields to defend their freedom. The red plumes of their horsehair crests stirred in the sea breeze like wheat in a highland meadow. For several days, the two armies watched each other across the plain, while dust devils danced in the space between their lines. The Persians, accustomed to swift submission from their enemies, waited for Greek resolve to crumble under the weight of imperial majesty. Their cavalry ranged across the coastal road, cutting off the direct route to Athens, while their archers practiced at targets set up within sight of the Greek position. Supply ships continued to arrive from Euboea, their holds disgorging the material wealth of empire, in confident preparation for the final advance on Athens. The Greeks, vastly outnumbered, and facing an enemy whose reputation for invincibility had been carved across 3 continents, found themselves caught between the desperate courage of free men and the calculated wisdom of experienced generals. Miltiades, elected as one of the 10 generals for this campaign, studied the Persian dispositions with the eye of a chess master contemplating an impossible game. The plain below offered no obvious advantage to the smaller Greek force, while the Persian cavalry threatened to sweep around their flanks like a tide engulfing a sandcastle. Yet somewhere in the geometry of bronze and flesh, the alignment of units and the timing of movements lay the seeds of what would become one of history's most remarkable victories. The morning that would decide the fate of Greek independence dawned clear and still, with only the gentlest breeze stirring the grass of the Marathon plain. Persian scouts reported no change in the Greek position, while their own forces completed the final preparations for what seemed certain to be a swift and decisive battle. The great king's war machine, tested in 100 campaigns and tempered by victory over every enemy it had faced, prepared to add Athens to the long list of cities that had learned to kneel before Persian power. The dust of Marathon had barely settled when the wheels of empire began turning once more, grinding slowly but inexorably toward a reckoning that would dwarf all previous conflicts. In the marble halls of Persepolis, where sunlight filtered through alabaster screens and cast dancing patterns on floors inlaid with precious stones, the defeat of Artaphernes and Datis echoed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward through the vast bureaucracy of the Persian Empire, reaching every corner of the known world, carrying with them the impossible news that a handful of Greek farmers and craftsmen had humbled the greatest military machine ever assembled by mortal hands. Darius the Great, King of Kings, Light of the Aryans, Shadow of God upon earth, received the news while reclining on cushions of silk beneath a canopy of gold thread. The messenger who brought word of Marathon prostrated himself so completely that his forehead left marks in the polished marble, and when the tale was told, a silence fell over the court that seemed to stretch toward eternity. The king's dark eyes, which had gazed upon the subjugation of nations and the construction of monuments that would outlast the stars, now turned inward, calculating and recalculating the impossible mathematics of defeat. Around him, courtiers held their breath, like divers plunging into unknown depths, sensing that the very foundations of their world had shifted beneath their feet. The months that followed Marathon witnessed a transformation in the heart of the Persian Empire, as profound as any wrought by conquest or catastrophe. In the workshops of Babylon, where master craftsmen had labored for generations to adorn the palaces of kings, new projects took shape under the king's direct supervision. Maps of unprecedented detail began to emerge from the scriptoriums, charts that traced every coastline from the Black Sea to the Pillars of Heracles, marking harbours and anchorages, river mouths and mountain passes. The accumulated wisdom of 1,000 navigators and merchants found its way onto papyrus and parchment, creating documents that would guide the greatest armada ever conceived by human ambition. Yet even as these preparations began, fate intervened with the cruel timing that governs the affairs of mortals. In the 4th year after Marathon, as winter's grip loosened on the Zagros Mountains, and the first spring flowers bloomed in the palace gardens, Darius the Great breathed his last breath. The king who had bridged the Bosphorus and carved royal inscriptions into the living rock of Behistun passed from the world, leaving behind him an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, and a son whose hunger for glory burned even brighter than his father's had done. The funeral ceremonies lasted 40 days, with processions that wound through streets strewn with rose petals and myrrh, while across the empire, satraps and governors offered sacrifices to ensure the king's safe passage to the realm of Ahura Mazda. Xerxes, the new king of kings, ascended to the throne with the memory of Marathon burning in his mind like a brand pressed into living flesh. Taller than his father, and possessed of a beauty that caught poets compared to the morning star, he moved through the world with the fluid grace of a panther stalking prey. The Greek victory had not merely been a military defeat, but an insult to the cosmic order itself, a defiance of the divine mandate that had raised the house of Achaemenid above all the nations of the earth. In the great audience hall at Persepolis, where columns rose like stone trees toward a ceiling painted with scenes of eternal spring, Xerxes gathered the greatest minds of his empire to plan a campaign that would erase the very memory of Marathon from human consciousness. The scale of preparation that followed defied the comprehension of ordinary mortals, involving logistics and engineering feats that would have challenged the gods themselves. From the cedar forests of Lebanon came timber cut according to specifications drawn up by master shipwrights, while from the iron mines of Anatolia flowed streams of metal that would be forged into weapons and armor for armies beyond counting. In Egypt, granaries that had supplied the pharaohs were emptied to fill the holds of transport vessels, and in Phoenicia, the descendants of those who had first dared to sail beyond the sight of land worked day and night to build a fleet that would darken the seas like a storm cloud sweeping across the wine-dark waters. The famous canal at Athos became a symbol of Persian ambition, made manifest in earth and stone, as thousands of labourers carved a channel through the rocky peninsula wide enough to accommodate 3 triremes sailing abreast. For 2 full years, the sound of picks and shovels rang across the Macedonian coastline, while engineers who had learned their craft, building the great highways that connected Sardis to Susa, solved problems that would have stymied lesser minds. When the work was complete, ships could pass from the Aegean to the Tauronaic Gulf without rounding the treacherous cape, where Mardonius had lost an entire fleet to the capricious winds that swept down from the mountains of Thrace. Meanwhile, across the breadth of the empire, a human tide began to gather that would dwarf all previous movements of peoples in recorded history. From the sun-baked plains of Bactria came horsemen whose ancestors had ridden with the wind across endless steppes, their recurved bows and iron-tipped arrows tested in countless raids against the wild tribes beyond the Oxus River. The mountains of Media contributed warriors whose shields bore the device of the golden eagle and whose spears had never been lowered in defeat, while from the valleys of Cappadocia marched infantry regiments trained in the rigid discipline that had made Persian arms victorious from the gates of Athens to the distant shores of the Indus. The logistical challenges alone would have broken the spirit of lesser administrators, but the Persian Empire had spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of moving armies across vast distances without losing cohesion or momentum. Supply depots were established at regular intervals along the royal roads, each stocked with grain and dried meat sufficient to feed a city for months, while herds of cattle and sheep were driven alongside the marching columns to provide fresh provisions. Water sources were identified and secured from the Hellespont to Marathon itself, and at each potential battlefield, Persian engineers surveyed the ground with the methodical precision of men who understood that victory often belonged to those who best controlled the flow of supplies, rather than the clash of bronze on bronze. In the harbour of Phoenician Tyre, where purple dye extracted from thousands of murex shells had once purchased the loyalty of kings, shipbuilders worked under the direction of admirals whose knowledge of wind and wave had been earned through decades of service in the furthest corners of the world. The vessels that took shape in their yards represented the pinnacle of naval architecture, with reinforced hulls capable of withstanding the battering of Mediterranean storms, and bronze rams designed to split enemy vessels like dried wood beneath the axe. Each ship was a floating fortress manned by warriors drawn from the maritime peoples of the empire. Sailors whose grandfathers had navigated by stars that Greek astronomers had not yet named, and whose skill at reading the subtle signs of weather and current would prove invaluable in the campaigns to come. The bridges that would span the Hellespont became monuments to Persian engineering genius and royal determination, their construction requiring techniques that pushed the boundaries of what contemporary technology could achieve. Hundreds of ships were lashed together with cables of flax and papyrus, their combined bulk forming platforms stable enough to support the passage of entire armies with their baggage trains and siege equipment. The work proceeded under the direct supervision of the king himself, who understood that this crossing would mark not merely a geographical transition, but a symbolic passage from the known world into legend. As the 4th year of preparation drew to a close, the sheer magnitude of what had been accomplished began to dawn on contemporary observers who had witnessed the gathering storm from its earliest stages. Herodotus would later write that the combined forces assembled by Xerxes numbered in the millions, a figure that modern historians debate, but which reflects the genuine awe that this mobilization inspired among those who witnessed it firsthand. The army that would march against Greece represented not merely the military might of the Persian Empire, but the culmination of centuries of imperial expansion and organizational refinement. A force so vast that its passage would alter the very landscape through which it moved, and whose approach would be announced by the dust clouds visible from horizon to horizon. The morning mist clung to the narrow pass of Thermopylae like ancient memory itself, swirling around the weathered stones that had witnessed countless travelers pass between the mountains and the sea. This slender corridor, no wider than a cart's width in places, stretched along the coast where the cliffs dropped sharply toward the waters of the Malian Gulf, creating a natural gateway that had funneled armies and merchants for generations beyond counting. The very name meant hot gates, drawn from the sulphurous springs that bubbled up from the earth nearby, their mineral-rich waters creating an otherworldly landscape of white deposits and steaming pools that seemed to mark this place as touched by the gods themselves. King Leonidas of Sparta arrived at this fateful ground with his chosen 300 warriors in the late summer of 480 BCE, their bronze shields catching the early light as they established their position across the narrowest point of the pass. These men represented the pinnacle of Spartan military tradition, each one a veteran of countless battles, selected not merely for their prowess with spear and sword, but for their unwavering commitment to the warrior's code that had shaped their lives since childhood. Their red cloaks moved like living flames in the coastal breeze, while their polished bronze armor reflected the harsh Mediterranean sun, creating an almost mythical sight that would be remembered and retold for millennia to come. Behind them stretched the broader Greek coalition that had gathered to face the Persian threat, including contingents from Thespiae, Thebes, and other city-states that had answered the call to defend Greek soil against the massive invasion force approaching from the north. The Thespians, numbering some 700 men, had marched alongside the Spartans with a determination that matched their more famous allies, while additional forces from various Greek cities brought the total defenders to perhaps 7,000 souls. These men represented the diverse tapestry of Greek civilization, bound together by shared language, shared gods, and now by the common threat that advanced toward them with the inexorable power of a natural force. The Persian host that approached Thermopylae defied easy comprehension, stretching across the landscape like a moving city that consumed everything in its path. Xerxes himself travelled in unprecedented luxury, his royal tent complex requiring hundreds of servants to maintain, while his mobile court included scribes, historians, and artists whose task was to record the expected triumph for posterity. The diversity of his forces reflected the vast extent of his empire, with immortals from Persia marching alongside Scythian archers, Thracian peltasts, and Indian cavalry, each contingent bringing their own weapons, armor, and fighting styles to create a military force unlike anything the world had ever seen. For 3 days, scouts had brought reports of this advancing multitude, describing dust clouds that rose to obscure the horizon and the sound of countless feet and hooves that created a rumble like distant thunder. The Persian advance guard began arriving at the southern approach to Thermopylae in the morning hours, their colourful banners and exotic armour creating a spectacular display that seemed to transform the very nature of the Greek landscape. The sight of elephants and camels, creatures that most Greeks had never seen, added to the sense that this was not merely an army, but an invasion from another world entirely. Leonidas walked among his men in the hours before battle, his weathered face calm beneath his bronze helmet, speaking quietly with his captains and adjusting the positioning of his forces with the careful attention of a craftsman perfecting his work. The Spartan king had lived his entire life preparing for moments such as this, trained from childhood in the harsh discipline that created warriors capable of facing impossible odds without flinching. His presence among the 300 carried a weight that extended far beyond his royal authority, representing the accumulated wisdom of generations of Spartan military tradition and the unbreakable bonds forged through years of shared hardship and training. The first assault came at dawn on the second day, as Persian arrows darkened the sky like a flight of locusts, their bronze points catching the light as they arced over the narrow pass. The Greek shields locked together in the formation they had practiced countless times, creating an unbroken wall of bronze that rang like temple bells as the arrows struck home. Behind this protective barrier, the Spartans waited with the patience of men who understood that battle was not about individual heroics, but about collective discipline, maintained through the chaos of combat. When the Persian infantry advanced, they met Greek spears, leveled with mathematical precision, each point positioned to create an impenetrable hedge of bronze and iron that channeled the enemy force into predetermined killing zones. The narrow confines of the pass worked perfectly to the Greeks' advantage, preventing the Persians from deploying their superior numbers effectively, while forcing them to fight on terms that favoured the heavily armoured and superbly trained defenders. The clash of bronze on bronze echoed off the mountainsides, while the war cries of a dozen different peoples created a symphony of violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient world. Hour after hour, the Persian waves broke against the Greek line like ocean swells against an immovable cliff, with bodies piling up in the narrow space between the opposing forces. The immortals themselves, the elite guard of Xerxes, advanced with their characteristic discipline and colourful robes, only to discover that their numbers meant nothing in a space where only the front ranks could engage effectively. Their arrows, so devastating in open battle, proved largely ineffective against the Greek shields and armor, while their lighter spears could not penetrate the bronze that encased their opponents from head to foot. As the day wore on, a strange rhythm developed in the fighting, with periods of intense combat alternating with moments of relative calm as both sides regrouped and tended to their wounded. The Greeks fought in shifts, allowing tired men to rest while fresh warriors took their place at the front, maintaining the integrity of their line through careful rotation that spoke to years of training and preparation. The ground beneath their feet grew slippery with blood and scattered with the debris of broken weapons and discarded equipment, creating treacherous footing that added another layer of complexity to the deadly dance being performed in this narrow corridor between mountain and sea. Persian commanders conferred anxiously as their casualties mounted, without any corresponding breakthrough, while Xerxes himself reportedly observed the battle from a high throne, positioned where he could witness the unfolding drama. The great king, who had bridged the Hellespont and commanded the loyalty of dozens of nations, found himself confronting a small force of Greeks who seemed to embody everything that his massive empire was not: compact, focused, and utterly committed to their cause, regardless of the odds arrayed against them. The second day brought renewed Persian attacks, with different contingents from across the empire taking their turn against the unyielding Greek line. Plataea archers, Bactrian cavalry, and Median spearmen all advanced and fell back, unable to make any meaningful progress against defenders who seemed to grow more determined with each assault. The narrow pass had become a bottleneck that negated every advantage the Persian force possessed, transforming what should have been an overwhelming victory into a grinding stalemate that threatened to undermine the entire campaign. Through it all, Leonidas remained a constant presence among his men, his voice carrying clearly over the din of battle as he offered encouragement and tactical adjustments with the calm authority of a man who had accepted his fate long before arriving at this place. The Spartan warriors responded to his leadership with the precision of a well-tuned instrument, each man knowing his role in the greater symphony of resistance that they were creating together. Their shields remained locked, their spears remained steady, and their determination remained absolute even as the sun began to set on another day of seemingly impossible defiance against the might of the Persian Empire. The narrow pass at Thermopylae had claimed its heroes, and with the fall of Leonidas and his 300 warriors, the great stone gate that had held back the Persian tide finally cracked open. The autumn winds carried more than the scent of fallen leaves across the Greek peninsula. They bore the acrid smoke of conquest, the thunderous footfalls of countless thousands, and the inexorable advance of an empire that had tasted blood and would not be denied. Xerxes had paid dearly for his passage through the hot gates, but the price had been met, and now the full might of Persia flowed southward, like a great dark river breaking through a dam. The news of Thermopylae's fall spread across Greece with the terrible swiftness of wildfire, carried by breathless messengers whose horses foamed at the mouth and whose voices cracked with exhaustion and despair. In every agora, around every hearth, in every temple where incense still burned to gods who seemed suddenly distant, the same dreadful questions echoed: how many had fallen, how long before the enemy arrived, and whether any power on earth could now prevent the complete subjugation of the Greek world. The heroic sacrifice of the Spartans had bought precious time, but time itself seemed to compress and accelerate as the Persian host descended from the northern mountains like an avalanche of bronze and flesh. Athens, the jewel of Attica, stood directly in the path of this approaching storm. The city's marble columns gleamed white in the Mediterranean sun, and the olive groves that crowned the surrounding hills rustled with the gentle breeze that had blessed this land since time immemorial. The Acropolis rose from the heart of the city like a sacred island, its temples and sanctuaries housing treasures accumulated over generations of prosperity and cultural flowering. Here stood the ancient olive tree of Athena, its gnarled branches heavy with the silver-green leaves that symbolized peace and wisdom. Here, too, were the countless works of art, the bronze statues and painted vases, the scrolls containing the wisdom of philosophers, and the verses of poets who had captured the very essence of what it meant to be Greek. But beneath the serene beauty of this September morning, Athens writhed in the grip of an impossible choice. The Persian army, now swollen to proportions that defied easy comprehension, had swept aside every force that dared oppose it south of Thermopylae. The Phocians had fled to the mountains, their cities abandoned to the flames. The Thebans had submitted, their leaders calculating that survival under Persian rule was preferable to annihilation in hopeless resistance. Even some of the smaller Attic towns had begun to empty as their inhabitants loaded possessions onto carts and boats, streaming towards Salamis and the islands, where they might find temporary refuge from the approaching tempest. Themistocles, the brilliant naval commander whose strategic vision had long prepared Athens for this moment, stood before the assembled citizens in the agora as the morning shadows grew short. His voice carried across the gathered crowd with the weight of absolute certainty. Athens must be evacuated, every man, woman, and child removed to safety, while the ships of the Allied fleet still controlled the narrow waters between Attica and Salamis. The city itself, with all its beauty and history, all its temples and treasures, would be offered as a sacrifice to buy time for the fleet to position itself for the decisive naval battle that would determine the fate of Greece. The crowd listened in stunned silence as Themistocles painted this stark picture. Their beloved city, abandoned, left defenseless and empty for the Persians to claim as they wished. The evacuation of Athens became a scene of heartbreak that would echo through history. Families that had lived in the same houses for generations loaded their most precious possessions onto carts and donkeys, knowing they might never return. Old men who had fought at Marathon 26 years earlier wept openly as they looked back at the city walls for what they believed might be the last time. Mothers clutched infants to their breasts while older children walked beside them, too young to fully understand why they were leaving everything familiar behind. The roads leading to Piraeus and the waiting ships became rivers of humanity, a slow-moving procession of refugees who had chosen exile over enslavement. The great harbour at Piraeus had never witnessed such a scene. Every vessel that could float had been pressed into service: warships, merchant galleys, fishing boats, even small coastal traders whose owners had volunteered their craft for the evacuation. The organised chaos of departure filled the air with shouts and orders, the creaking of ropes and the splash of oars as boat after boat pulled away from the docks and headed across the narrow strait to Salamis. Some ships rode low in the water under the weight of their human cargo, while others carried the portable treasures of temples and the archives of the city's government. The sacred objects of Athenian religion made their own journey into exile: statues of gods carefully wrapped in linen, ancient tripods that had proclaimed oracles for centuries, and the eternal flame that had burned in Athena's temple since the city's founding. Salamis, the island that would serve as Athens' temporary refuge, transformed overnight from a quiet backwater into one of the most densely populated places in the Greek world. Every house, every temple, every available shelter overflowed with evacuees. Tent cities sprouted along the beaches, where families tried to recreate some semblance of normal life, while the men among them prepared to man the ships of the Allied fleet. The narrow channel between Salamis and the Attic coast became a highway of constant traffic, as boats ferried supplies and messengers back and forth, keeping the refugee community connected to the unfolding drama on the mainland. From the hills of Salamis, the Athenian exiles could see their city across the water, still beautiful in the distance, but growing more vulnerable with each passing hour. The advance guard of the Persian army had been spotted moving through the passes of Mount Parnes, their bronze armor glinting like stars against the dark slopes. Soon the main body would arrive, and with it would come the moment that every Athenian dreaded: the entry of foreign soldiers into their sacred city, the violation of their temples, and the systematic destruction of everything they held dear. Xerxes himself arrived at the head of his great host on a day when the autumn sky hung heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the darkness settling over Greece. The great king established his camp on the plain north of Athens, his magnificent pavilion rising like a small city in itself, surrounded by the countless tents and cooking fires of an army that stretched beyond the horizon. From his throne, covered in gold and precious stones, the King of Kings could look across the empty city that lay spread before him like a gift. The evacuation had been so complete that barely a soul remained within the walls. Only a few desperate defenders, who had barricaded themselves on the Acropolis, determined to make a final stand in the shadow of Athena's temple. The siege of the Acropolis proved to be merely a formality. The handful of Athenians who had remained behind fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they faced certain death, but they were vastly outnumbered and completely cut off from any hope of relief. Persian archers filled the air with arrows that fell like deadly rain, while engineers prepared the scaling ladders and siege equipment that would make short work of the ancient fortifications. The defenders held out for several days, their resistance a final flickering flame of defiance, but the outcome was never in doubt. When the citadel finally fell, the last defenders were put to the sword, their bodies left where they fell among the broken stones and scattered offerings. Then came the fire. Xerxes had given his orders with the cold precision of a man settling accounts. Athens was to be burned completely, every building reduced to ash and rubble as punishment for the city's role in burning Sardis 2 decades earlier. Persian soldiers moved methodically through the empty streets, their torches turning the morning air thick with smoke. The flames took hold with terrifying speed, consuming the wooden frameworks of houses, melting the lead joints of marble blocks, and sending great columns of black smoke spiraling into the autumn sky. The olive groves that had crowned the hills around the city were cut down and set ablaze, their ancient trunks crackling and hissing as they were consumed. From Salamis, the Athenian refugees watched their city die. The smoke was visible for miles, a dark stain against the blue sky that spoke more eloquently than any messenger of the completeness of their loss. Children pointed at the distant flames and asked questions their parents could not answer. Old men sat in silence, remembering streets and buildings that were being erased from existence, even as they watched. The temples where they had worshipped, the theatres where they had laughed and wept, the schools where their children had learned to read, all of it was feeding the appetite of flames that seemed to burn with supernatural hunger. The destruction continued for days, each morning bringing fresh columns of smoke as the Persians moved systematically through different quarters of the city. The great temple of Athena on the Acropolis was stripped of its treasures before being put to the torch, its ancient olive tree, the sacred gift of the goddess herself, withering in the heat of the surrounding fires. Libraries burned with their scrolls still on the shelves, their knowledge lost in the space between one breath and the next. Workshops that had produced the finest pottery and sculpture in the known world collapsed into themselves, their tools and masterpieces becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding ash. This was Greece's darkest hour, when the light of civilization itself seemed to flicker and dim beneath the weight of Persian conquest. From the ashes of their beloved Athens, the Greeks faced their darkest hour with the methodical persistence that would define their ultimate triumph. While Xerxes stood among the ruins of the Acropolis, surveying what must have seemed like the inevitable conclusion of his grand campaign, one man among the Greek leadership harbored a vision that would transform catastrophe into opportunity. Themistocles, the Athenian statesman whose prescient understanding of naval warfare had already begun to reshape the Mediterranean world, gazed across the waters that separated the Greek fleet from the Persian armada and saw not defeat, but possibility floating on every wave. The strategic mind of Themistocles operated with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. Where others saw only the overwhelming numbers of the Persian fleet, nearly 1,200 vessels stretching across the horizon like a floating city, he perceived the fundamental weakness that would prove decisive. These ships, drawn from every corner of Xerxes' vast empire, represented not unity, but a collection of maritime traditions that had never truly learned to operate as one. Phoenician galleys moved with different rhythms than Egyptian vessels, while the ships of the Ionian Greeks, pressed into service against their will, carried crews whose hearts remained with their ancestral homeland rather than their Persian overlords. The narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland presented themselves to Themistocles' strategic imagination like a natural amphitheatre designed by the gods themselves for naval combat. These waters, barely more than a mile wide at their narrowest point, would compress the Persian numerical advantage into a confined space where seamanship and coordination would matter more than sheer quantity. The currents that flowed through these channels had carved their patterns over countless centuries, creating eddies and underwater formations that local Greek sailors knew with intimate familiarity, while the Persian admirals would navigate these treacherous waters as strangers in an alien sea. Convincing the other Greek commanders to stake everything on this single naval engagement required all of Themistocles' considerable powers of persuasion. The Spartan admiral Eurybiades, trained in the land-based military traditions of his people, initially viewed any prolonged naval engagement with deep suspicion. The Corinthian captains argued for withdrawal to the Isthmus of Corinth, where they could defend their home territories behind the narrow land bridge that connected the Peloponnese to central Greece. Yet Themistocles understood that retreat would only delay the inevitable. Scattered across different defensive positions, the Greek forces would be defeated piecemeal by an enemy that could afford to suffer losses that would devastate the smaller Greek fleet. The deception that would draw the Persian fleet into the trap required a performance worthy of the greatest theatrical productions that Athens had ever staged. Through carefully chosen intermediaries, Themistocles allowed word to reach Persian intelligence that the Greek fleet planned to slip away under cover of darkness, abandoning their position at Salamis and fleeing toward the Peloponnese. This false intelligence played perfectly into Xerxes' desire for a swift, decisive victory that would end the Greek resistance once and for all. The Persian king ordered his fleet to position itself for a dawn attack that would catch the Greeks in the act of retreat, sealing off all possible escape routes through the narrow straits. As the Persian ships moved into position during the pre-dawn hours of that September morning in 480 BCE, the water around Salamis came alive with the gentle splash of oars and the creaking of rope and timber. Hundreds of vessels maneuvered in the darkness, guided by signal fires and the whispered commands of officers who dared not raise their voices above the lapping of waves against hulls. The Persian strategy relied on overwhelming force applied simultaneously from multiple directions, a pincer movement that would trap the Greek fleet against the shoreline and methodically destroy it, ship by ship. Dawn broke across the Saronic Gulf with the kind of crystalline clarity that often follows storms, revealing a scene that must have filled Xerxes with satisfaction as he took his position on a golden throne placed on the heights of Mount Aigaleo. From this elevated vantage point, the Persian king could observe the entire battle as if watching a great spectacle arranged for his entertainment. Below him, his magnificent fleet deployed in perfect formation, the morning sun glinting off bronze ram heads and the polished armor of marines who crowded the decks. The sight of this armada, representing the naval power of the greatest empire the world had ever known, should have struck terror into any opposing force. The Greek response emerged from the shadows of Salamis with a discipline and coordination that spoke to months of careful preparation under Themistocles' guidance. Rather than the chaotic retreat that Persian intelligence had predicted, the Greek triremes moved forward in perfect battle formation, their bronze rams cutting through the water with the purposeful grace of hunting dolphins. Each ship carried approximately 200 men, 170 rowers, 30 marines, and a handful of officers and archers, all trained to function as a single organism in the deadly dance of ancient naval warfare. The trireme itself represented the pinnacle of ancient naval engineering, a vessel designed specifically for ramming combat that could accelerate from rest to attack speed in mere moments. These ships stretched nearly 120 feet in length, but measured only 18 feet at their widest point, creating a profile that sliced through water with minimal resistance while providing maximum momentum for their bronze-sheathed rams. The rowing benches, arranged in 3 banks that gave the trireme its name, allowed for incredible maneuverability and speed, transforming each vessel into a kind of sea-going projectile under the control of a skilled captain. As the two fleets closed the distance between them, the narrow confines of the strait began to work their strategic magic exactly as Themistocles had envisioned. The Persian formation, designed for open water combat, became increasingly compressed and tangled as ships found themselves unable to maneuver freely. Vessels that had been positioned to support each other instead began to interfere with neighboring ships' movements, creating confusion and missed opportunities that multiplied with each passing moment of the engagement. The first collision sent shockwaves through both fleets as a Greek trireme struck a Persian vessel amidships, the bronze ram punching through seasoned timber with a sound like thunder rolling across the water. Within moments, the sea around the impact became a chaos of splintered wood, struggling sailors, and the desperate shouts of officers trying to maintain control of their vessels. The Persian ship, mortally wounded by the ram strike, began to list heavily as water poured through the gaping hole in its hull, but its crew continued to fight with the desperate courage of men who knew that surrender meant slavery or death. The battle rapidly expanded into a melee that stretched across the entire width of the strait, with individual ship-to-ship combats creating a mosaic of violence and seamanship that played out against the backdrop of larger tactical movements. Greek vessels, smaller and more maneuverable than many of their Persian counterparts, darted in and out of the enemy formation like wolves attacking a herd, striking quick blows before wheeling away to avoid retaliation. The superior local knowledge of the Greek captains became apparent as they used subtle currents and underwater obstacles to their advantage, luring Persian ships into positions where they became vulnerable to ramming attacks or found themselves trapped against the rocky shoreline. Persian numerical superiority, so overwhelming in the open waters off Attica, became a liability in the constricted space of the strait. Ships waiting their turn to engage found themselves crowded together in formations that prevented mutual support, while vessels attempting to retreat after taking damage discovered their escape routes blocked by their own reinforcements moving forward into the battle. The careful coordination that characterized Persian military operations on land proved impossible to maintain in the fluid, three-dimensional environment of naval combat, where split-second decisions and individual initiative often mattered more than adherence to overall strategy. The turning point came as the morning sun climbed higher, casting the entire battle in sharp relief against the deep blue of the Aegean waters. A section of the Persian line, composed primarily of Phoenician vessels that had fought with distinction in countless previous engagements, found itself isolated and surrounded by Greek triremes that attacked from multiple angles simultaneously. The systematic destruction of this formation sent ripples of panic through the Persian fleet, as crews realized that their numerical advantage meant nothing if they could not bring it to bear effectively in the narrow waters where the battle was being decided. Xerxes, watching from his throne on Mount Aigaleo, witnessed the gradual dissolution of his naval supremacy with the horrified fascination of a man seeing his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. The ships that had carried his armies across the Hellespont, the vessels that represented the maritime power of dozens of subject nations, were being systematically outmaneuvered and destroyed by a smaller force that fought with the desperate precision of men defending their homeland against foreign invasion. The great king's dreams of swift victory transformed into a nightmare of tactical defeat that would echo through the corridors of Persian power for generations to come. The waters around Salamis still carried the debris of shattered triremes when autumn winds began to stir across the Aegean, bringing with them the scent of change and the promise of a new season's campaigns. Xerxes stood upon the shores of Attica, his magnificent robes no longer gleaming quite so brilliantly in the Mediterranean sun, watching as the last remnants of his naval supremacy drifted like broken dreams upon the tide. The great king who had bridged the Hellespont and darkened the seas with his fleet now found himself contemplating a reality that no Persian monarch had ever faced: the prospect of retreat from lands already claimed in the name of Ahura Mazda. The Persian army, though bloodied by the naval disaster, remained a formidable force sprawled across the Greek landscape like a living carpet of bronze and steel. Hundreds of thousands of warriors from the farthest reaches of the empire, Medes with their flowing robes, Scythian horse archers whose arrows could darken the sky, Indian infantry with their cotton armor, and the cream of Persian nobility in their scale mail that caught the light like fish scales beneath clear water, all waited in their vast encampments for word from their god-king. The very ground seemed to pulse with their presence, cook fires sending thin columns of smoke into the crisp air, while the sound of 10,000 conversations in a dozen languages created a constant low murmur that rolled across the plains like distant thunder. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the cosmic balance of this great contest. Something that went far beyond the mere counting of ships lost or men drowned. The aura of Persian invincibility, that invisible armor that had protected their armies through decades of conquest, had been pierced by Greek bronze and shattered upon the rocks of Salamis. In the councils of war that stretched late into the night, Persian generals who had never known defeat found themselves speaking in hushed tones about supply lines that stretched impossibly thin across hostile territory, about Greek armies that seemed to multiply like the heads of the Hydra whenever one was destroyed, about the approach of winter in a land where every village might harbor enemies. Mardonius, perhaps the finest general in the Persian host, and certainly the most devoted to the dream of European conquest, argued with passionate eloquence for continuing the campaign. His words painted visions of Greek cities opening their gates in submission, of Spartan warriors finally broken upon Persian spears, of the rich lands of the Peloponnese feeding Persian granaries for generations to come. The firelight flickered across his weathered features as he spoke, casting dancing shadows that seemed to give life to his ambitious plans, while around the council tent, the night air carried the scent of burning cedar and the distant sound of sentries calling out their watch. But Xerxes had seen enough of Greek defiance to last a lifetime of kingship. The memory of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans had died rather than yield a single step of Greek soil, haunted his dreams like vengeful spirits. The sight of his magnificent fleet burning upon the waters of Salamis had taught him that the Greeks possessed something his vast empire could not easily overcome. A fierce love of their homeland that transformed ordinary men into heroes willing to die for ideals that Persian gold could not purchase. The great king made his decision with the weight of empire pressing upon his shoulders, choosing to withdraw the bulk of his forces while leaving Mardonius with a carefully selected army to continue the conquest during the following year's campaign season. The Persian retreat began with all the pageantry that had marked their advance, but now the glittering procession moved eastward toward the familiar lands of Asia rather than west toward the unconquered territories of Greece. Xerxes himself led the withdrawal, his golden chariot rolling along roads that had been built by Greek hands, but now served to carry their would-be conqueror back toward the rising sun. Behind him stretched a column of soldiers and civilians that seemed to have no end, their footsteps raising clouds of dust that hung in the still air like earthbound clouds. The very birds seemed to fall silent as this great migration passed, as if nature itself recognized the historical significance of this moment, when the tide of Persian expansion finally began to ebb. Mardonius watched his king disappear into the distance with something approaching relief. For now, he could wage war according to his own strategic vision, rather than serving the whims of a monarch who had never fully understood the unique challenges posed by Greek warfare. The army that remained under his command, though smaller than the original invasion force, still numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and included the finest regiments from every corner of the Persian Empire. Through the long winter months, these warriors made their camps in the fertile regions of northern Greece, their presence like a sleeping dragon that might wake at any moment to breathe fire across the Greek city-states. The coming of spring brought with it the sweet fragrance of wildflowers blooming across the Greek countryside, and the bitter knowledge that the final act of this great drama was about to unfold. Mardonius moved his massive army southward through landscapes that had witnessed the footsteps of gods and heroes, past olive groves that had stood since the time of Solon, and vineyards that produced wine for symposiums, where philosophers debated the nature of courage and virtue. The Persian host advanced like a slow tide of bronze and leather, their banners snapping in the warm breeze, while the earth trembled beneath the measured tread of their march. The Greeks, meanwhile, had spent the winter months forging an alliance that would have seemed impossible just months before, as ancient rivalries were set aside in the face of existential threat. Spartan hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder with Athenian citizens, while warriors from dozens of smaller city-states contributed their strength to a cause that transcended local politics and petty territorial disputes. The combined Greek army that took the field in the spring of 479 represented something unprecedented in their history, a truly unified Hellenic force committed to driving the Persian invader from European soil forever. The two armies finally came together on the rolling plains near Plataea, a small city that would soon lend its name to one of history's most decisive battles. The Persian position stretched across the landscape like a crescent moon, with Mardonius placing his most trusted troops in the center, while positioning contingents of subject Greek allies on the flanks, a decision that would prove fateful when the moment of crisis arrived. The morning air carried the scent of dew-dampened grass and the distant aroma of cooking fires from both camps, while the sun climbed slowly above the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across ground that would soon be consecrated with the blood of heroes. For days, the two armies faced each other across the plain, each side seeking advantage through maneuver and psychological warfare, while their commanders studied terrain and weather with the careful attention of farmers planning the season's planting. Persian cavalry swept across the open ground like hunting hawks, their arrows whistling through the morning air, while Greek phalanxes maintained their disciplined formations with the steady patience that had become their trademark. The very earth seemed to hold its breath as these two great military traditions prepared for their final confrontation, with the future of European civilization hanging in the balance like morning mist above a quiet river. When the battle finally erupted, it came with all the fury that had been building through months of anticipation and preparation. The Persian center, anchored by Mardonius and his household troops, struck the Greek line with tremendous force, their war cries echoing across the plain, while bronze clashed against bronze in a symphony of violence that could be heard for miles. But the Greeks, fighting now not just for their cities, but for the very concept of freedom itself, held their formations with a determination that seemed to draw strength from the soil of their ancestors, and slowly, inexorably, began to push back against the Persian tide. The turning point came when Mardonius himself fell in the swirling melee, his death sending shockwaves through the Persian ranks that no amount of gold or royal authority could repair. Without their beloved general to rally around, the great Persian army began to fragment like a clay vessel struck by bronze, each contingent seeking its own path to safety, while the Greeks pressed forward with the relentless precision of a rising tide. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a disaster, as Persian dreams of European empire crumbled beneath the spears of men who valued freedom more than life itself. As the sun set over the battlefield at Plataea, it illuminated a scene that marked the end of an era in world history. The Persian threat to Greek independence had been broken forever upon the shields of free men, and the survivors of Mardonius's great army began their long journey back toward the familiar lands of Asia, leaving behind them the graves of their comrades and the shattered remnants of imperial ambition. The dust of Plataea had barely settled when the winds of change began to stir across the Aegean waters. While the Persian survivors trudged eastward along the familiar paths that had once carried their confident advance, the Greek fleet gathered like storm clouds on the horizon, heavy with purpose and the intoxicating scent of victory. The ships rode low in the water, their bronze rams catching the morning light, their painted eyes staring toward the distant shores of Asia Minor, where Greek cities had languished under Persian rule for nearly half a century. Admiral Leotychidas stood at the prow of his flagship, his weathered hands gripping the painted rail as the Spartan fleet cut through the wine-dark waters. Behind him stretched a formidable armament of triremes, their oars moving in perfect synchronization, creating a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of Greek determination. The Athenian contingent sailed parallel to their course, commanded by Xanthippus, whose tactical brilliance had already proven itself in the narrow waters near Salamis. Together, these fleets represented something unprecedented in Greek history, a unified naval force operating not in defense of their homeland, but in pursuit of liberation for their distant kinsmen. The first target of this ambitious campaign lay nestled against the rocky coastline of Samos, where the remnants of the Persian fleet had sought refuge like wounded animals retreating to their lair. The Persian admiral Tigranes had anchored his vessels in the natural harbour, their hulls scarred from previous encounters, their crews demoralized by the string of defeats that had befallen their empire. The sight that greeted the Greeks as they rounded the headland spoke of an enemy already half defeated, ships beached and partially dismantled, their masts lying like fallen trees across the sand, while Persian soldiers worked frantically to construct makeshift fortifications along the shoreline. At Mycale, the final confrontation between the Persian fleet and their Greek pursuers unfolded with the inexorable quality of destiny fulfilling itself. The morning mist clung to the water's surface, transforming the approaching Greek vessels into ghostly apparitions that seemed to materialize from the realm of legend itself. As the fog lifted, revealing the full extent of the Greek armada, the Persian defenders found themselves facing a force that embodied not just military might, but the collective will of a people who had tasted freedom and would not relinquish it. The battle itself became less a naval engagement than an amphibious assault, as the Greeks beached their ships and charged across the narrow strand separating sea from land. The Persian fortifications, hastily constructed from ships' timbers and beach stones, crumbled beneath the weight of Greek determination like sandcastles before an advancing tide. Spartan hoplites advanced with their characteristic disciplined precision, their bronze shields locked together in an unbreakable wall, while Athenian marines swept around the flanks with the fluid grace of men who had learned their warfare in the cramped quarters of trireme decks. The destruction of the Persian fleet at Mycale sent ripples across the eastern Aegean that reached far beyond the immediate tactical victory. In cities along the Ionian coast that had endured decades of Persian oversight, the news travelled through networks of merchants and fishermen, whispered in marketplaces, and discussed in hushed tones in the shadows of Persian garrisons. The liberation that had once seemed as distant as the setting sun now appeared as tangible as the Greek ships visible on the horizon. Sestos, perched on its commanding height overlooking the Hellespont, became the next jewel in the crown of Greek conquest. The city's strategic importance could hardly be overstated. It controlled the narrow passage between Europe and Asia, the throat through which Persian armies had poured into Greece and through which they now sought to retreat. The siege that followed demonstrated the evolution of Greek military thinking from the desperate defensive measures of Marathon and Thermopylae to the calculated offensive operations of a confident alliance. The Athenian forces, led by Xanthippus, with methodical patience, established their siege lines across the neck of the peninsula, cutting off all land approaches to the fortress city. Their engineers, drawing upon knowledge gained from generations of quarrying marble from Pentelicus and constructing the great works of the Acropolis, set about the systematic reduction of Sestos's defences with the same careful attention to detail that marked their architectural achievements. Wooden towers rose beside the ancient walls, their heights carefully calculated to overtop the Persian battlements, while covered galleries snaked forward like great serpents, protecting the advancing Greek assault troops from the arrows and stones that rained down from above. Inside Sestos, the Persian garrison commander Artayctus found himself in an increasingly desperate position. His supplies dwindled with each passing day, while outside the walls the Greek forces seemed to multiply like the heads of the Hydra. The sight of Greek ships patrolling the Hellespont below served as a constant reminder that no relief would come from the Asian shore. The Persian Empire, which had once seemed as permanent and immovable as the mountains themselves, now appeared to be crumbling at its very foundations. The fall of Sestos opened the floodgates of liberation throughout the region. Greek cities that had submitted to Persian rule decades earlier now witnessed the return of their exiled aristocrats, sailing home in the wake of the victorious fleets. In Byzantium, the ancient stronghold that commanded the Bosphorus, Persian officials found themselves suddenly isolated as the local population rose in support of their approaching liberators. The great chains that had once sealed harbours against Greek attack now hung slack and unused, while Persian garrisons melted away like snow before the advancing spring. Each liberated city became both a symbol and a practical base for further operations. Greek engineers studied the defensive works that Persian architects had constructed, learning valuable lessons about siege warfare and fortification that would serve them well in future campaigns. Local knowledge, accumulated over decades of Persian rule, now flowed freely to the Greek commanders. Information about supply routes, garrison strengths, and the political loyalties of neighbouring communities. The transformation of the Aegean from a Persian lake into a Greek sea marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Merchant vessels that had once carried tribute to Persian treasuries now sailed freely between Greek ports, their holds filled with goods that would enrich the very cities that had launched this campaign of liberation. The wealth that had once flowed eastward to support the luxuries of Persian palaces now remained within the Greek world, funding the reconstruction of temples destroyed during the Persian invasions, and supporting the artists and craftsmen who would create the golden age of Greek culture. In the quiet harbours of newly liberated cities, elderly men gathered to share stories of the years of exile and subjugation, their voices mixing with the sound of waves lapping against stone quays, where Greek ships now anchored in safety. Children who had grown up knowing only Persian rule now ran freely through streets where Greek was spoken openly once again, their laughter echoing off walls that had once muffled such expressions of joy. The temples, long closed or converted to Persian religious practices, reopened their doors to welcome back the ancient gods, whose worship had sustained Greek identity through the long years of foreign domination. The strategic implications of these victories extended far beyond the immediate military gains. Control of the Hellespont and the Aegean Islands meant that any future Persian attempt to invade Europe would face the same naval challenges that had contributed to Xerxes' defeat. The Greek fleets, now battle-tested and confident, patrolled waters that Persian ships could no longer consider safe passage. The great bridge of boats that had carried Xerxes' army into Greece became impossible to reconstruct, not just because of the engineering challenges, but because the Greeks now possessed the naval strength to prevent any such construction project. As winter approached and the campaigning season drew to a close, the Greek commanders gathered in council aboard their flagship to assess the remarkable transformation they had accomplished. The maps spread before them told a story that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The Persian Empire's European foothold had been not just eliminated, but reversed, with Greek influence now extending deep into territories that had been Persian for generations. The counter-offensive that had begun as a pursuit of fleeing enemies had evolved into a systematic campaign of liberation that would reshape the political geography of the ancient world. The success of these operations established patterns of Greek military cooperation and strategic thinking that would influence warfare for centuries to come. The combination of Spartan discipline and Athenian innovation, tested in the crucible of desperate defense, had proven equally effective in the arena of offensive operations. The ships that had once fled before Persian naval superiority now ruled the waves, with an authority that would endure long after the immediate threat had passed into memory. The echoes of bronze against bronze had long since faded from Marathon's coastal plain, yet something profound had awakened in the Greek world that would never again fall silent. In the aftermath of their victories, the city-states found themselves transformed, no longer merely collections of farmers and merchants clinging to rocky peninsulas, but inheritors of something far more precious than gold or territory. The Persian Wars had forged in the crucible of conflict a new understanding of what it meant to be Greek, and in doing so, had unknowingly laid the cornerstone of a civilization that would echo through millennia. The transformation began quietly, in the conversations that followed the soldiers home from distant battlefields. Veterans of Salamis spoke not merely of ships and fire, but of the moment they realized that their small homeland had defied the greatest empire the world had ever known. These were men who had grown up hearing tales of Persian might, of armies that darkened the horizons, and treasuries that held the wealth of nations. Yet they had stood firm against this tide and watched it break upon the shores of their determination. The stories they told their children carried within them a new conception of Greek worth, a recognition that their language, their gods, their way of organizing society held something unique and valuable enough to die defending. This emerging sense of Greek identity manifested itself most clearly in the realm of ideas, where philosophers and poets began to articulate what had previously been felt, but never expressed. The concept of freedom, which had once seemed as natural and unremarkable as breathing, now took on deeper philosophical dimensions. Greek thinkers began to explore the relationship between the individual and the state, between personal liberty and collective responsibility, laying intellectual groundwork that would eventually support the great democratic experiments of Athens and other city-states. The Persian model of absolute monarchy, where millions bowed before a single ruler who claimed divine sanction, had been weighed in the balance and found wanting by people who had proven that free citizens fighting for their homes could triumph over subjects compelled by fear. The artistic flowering that followed carried within it unmistakable traces of this new confidence. Sculptors began to carve figures that stood with unprecedented dignity and self-possession, their marble forms embodying the Greek belief that human beings, when living freely and virtuously, represented something approaching divine perfection. The great tragedies that emerged from this period wrestled with questions of fate and freedom, of the individual's relationship to cosmic forces, themes that would have held little meaning for a people who had never been forced to examine their own values under the harsh light of existential threat. The temples that rose during these decades spoke not merely of devotion to the gods, but of a people's growing confidence in their ability to create beauty worthy of divine attention. The military innovations born of necessity during the Persian conflicts would reshape warfare far beyond the Greek world. The tactical flexibility that had allowed Greek armies to adapt their fighting methods to different enemies and terrains became a hallmark of Western military thinking. More significantly, the concept that citizen soldiers fighting for their own communities possessed advantages over professional armies serving distant masters took root in Greek consciousness. This idea would influence military organization for centuries to come, creating a tradition that valued the motivated amateur over the disciplined professional, a preference that would echo through Roman legions and medieval militias alike. The political ramifications proved even more enduring than the military ones. The Persian Wars had demonstrated that Greek city-states could cooperate when faced with existential threats, but they had also revealed the tremendous power that could be unleashed when such cooperation occurred. Athens, having provided the largest naval forces and borne much of the financial burden of the later campaigns, emerged from the conflicts with unprecedented influence over its former allies. The Delian League, initially formed as a defensive alliance against future Persian aggression, gradually evolved into something approaching an Athenian empire, with tribute flowing into Athenian treasuries to fund the great building projects that would make the city the cultural center of the Greek world. The intellectual heritage of the Persian Wars extended far beyond military tactics or political arrangements into the realm of historical consciousness itself. Herodotus, writing his great work on the conflicts, established many of the conventions that would govern historical writing in the Western tradition. His approach to understanding the past, which sought to identify causes and consequences, rather than simply recording events, created a template for rational inquiry into human affairs. The questions he posed about cultural differences, about the relationship between environment and character, about the role of chance and choice in shaping human destiny, became foundational concerns for later generations of thinkers and writers. The Persian Wars also established a template for understanding the relationship between East and West that would influence European thinking for millennia. The conflict came to be seen not merely as a political or military struggle, but as a clash between fundamentally different approaches to organizing human society. The East was characterized as despotic, luxurious, and effeminate, while the West was portrayed as free, disciplined, and masculine. This binary, however oversimplified and often inaccurate, provided a framework through which later civilizations would understand their own encounters with foreign cultures and political systems. The legacy lived on most powerfully in the realm of civic virtue and public responsibility. The generation that had fought at Marathon and Salamis had learned that their freedom depended not on the protection of kings or the favor of gods, but on their own willingness to sacrifice for the common good. This lesson was passed down through families and embedded in the educational systems of the Greek city-states, creating a culture that valued active participation in public life as both a privilege and a duty. The Athenian ideal of the citizen who was simultaneously warrior, participant in the assembly, and patron of the arts emerged directly from the experiences of the Persian Wars, creating a model of civic engagement that would inspire Republicans and Democrats throughout history. As the immediate memories of the wars faded and new generations grew up hearing the stories secondhand, the conflicts took on an almost mythological quality. Marathon became not simply a military victory, but a symbol of the triumph of the few over the many, of righteousness over mere power. Thermopylae evolved into an archetype of heroic sacrifice, while Salamis represented the victory of intelligence and cooperation over brute force. These symbolic interpretations, while perhaps losing some connection to the complex realities of the actual events, gained a different kind of power as inspirational narratives that could motivate people facing their own challenges and crises. The philosophical schools that emerged in the centuries following the Persian Wars continued to grapple with the fundamental questions that the conflicts had raised about human nature, political organization, and the relationship between individual freedom and collective security. Plato's ideal republic, Aristotle's analysis of different forms of government, and the Stoic emphasis on virtue and duty all bore the intellectual DNA of a civilization that had been forced to examine its own deepest assumptions under the pressure of foreign invasion. The quiet revolution in consciousness that followed the Persian Wars would eventually spread far beyond the borders of the Greek world. Roman authors, drawing on Greek historians and philosophers, absorbed and transmitted these ideas throughout their vast empire. Christian theologians, trained in Greek philosophical methods, would incorporate Greek concepts of individual dignity and moral responsibility into their religious systems. Islamic scholars, translating and preserving Greek texts, would ensure that these ideas survived the chaos of the medieval period to inspire later generations of European thinkers. In the end, the greatest victory achieved by the Greeks in their conflicts with Persia may not have been the preservation of their political independence, but rather the creation of intellectual and cultural patterns that would prove remarkably resilient and adaptable. The belief that human beings possessed inherent dignity and capacity for self-governance, the conviction that truth could be discovered through rational inquiry rather than received from authority, the understanding that freedom required both individual virtue and collective commitment to the common good. These ideas, forged in the heat of conflict with the Persian Empire, would continue to shape human civilization long after the last Persian soldier had departed Greek soil. The bronze weapons of Marathon had returned to dust, but the ideas they had defended would prove as enduring as the mountains themselves, quietly shaping the consciousness of peoples who would never even learn the names of the battles where their intellectual inheritance had been secured.